A warm welcome to the 4 teams for making to the final round. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few key items just so you know how to participate in today's event. Each team will first present their analysis on the prescribed policy case, land and housing controversy in Hong Kong, in 10 minutes, followed by preparation and rounds of structured and free debates, as well as a Q&A session. The order for pitches and debates will be decided by lottery during the opening session. Throughout the competition, you may send in your questions regarding any logistic and technical issues at any time during the presentation. We will collect and address them as soon as possible. Because the case competition is about to start, please be noted that all team members should turn on their web cameras and use the virtual background provided at all times during this competition session. Please also be reminded to rename yourselves according to your team ID and also team name. Thank you. Thank you, team. So before starting the competition, I would now like to take a moment to honor and thank our dedicated judges who volunteered their time and effort. It is my pleasure to introduce them in alphabetical order, which include Professor Anthony CHEUNG, GBS JP, Adjunct Professor of the Division of Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, also a Research Chair Professor of Public Administration at the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong, as well as a former Secretary for Transport and Housing of the HKUST government. So welcome, Professor CHEUNG. And also Dr. Lina VYAS, Associate Professor of the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Dr. VYAS. And also Dr. Natalie Wong, Visiting Fellow of the Department of Public Policy at the City University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Dr. Wong. Last but not least, Dr. Simon Yao, Associate Professor of the Department of Public Policy at the City University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Dr. Yao. So a warm welcome to the judges who volunteered their time and effort in becoming the judges for this final round. Thanks all. Before we begin our pitches, we invite you to keep such focus to join us for the lottery session. Now, may I invite Professor James Wong, convener of the organizing committee, to conduct the lottery session?
Let's start the lottery section. The section is very simple. We will utilize the website online. So I'm trying to share the screen now. Okay. So we'll be using this wheel of names website to do the lottery. So the lottery will decide on the order of pitches and debates. So could I invite all the teams, all the 4 teams, to check your information on the right-hand side of the share screen. So make sure the information is correct. I suppose all the information is correct. We have Team C, Jarvis, CUHK, and Team H, bring Interceptors from EdUHK. And the third item, Team I, G4 from HKUST. And lastly, Team L, INNOSIGHT, HKUST. So I will now draw the group, draw the team, being the first in the queue. So the first team to do the pitch and to ask questions in the debating section. So the first team is Team L, INNOSIGHT, HKUST. So Team L, please make a note of it. Now I'm removing Team L. So here comes the second team in the queue. Okay, so it's decided by the system. The second team is Team H, bring Interceptors from Education University of Hong Kong. So Team H, please make a note. You are the second team. I'm removing Team H. And lastly, the third team and the fourth team. So the third team is Team C, Jarvis from Chinese University of Hong Kong. So Team C, you are the third team. Please make a note of it. And last but not least, we have Team I being the fourth team for the pitches and debates. So team I, you are the fourth team. Is there any objection? Is there any objection? Any comments or objections? If not, I would like to pass the time back to Yvonne. Yvonne, please, over to you again.
Thank you, James. So to recap the order for team pitches and debate, team 1 is team L, INNOSIGHT. The second team will be team H, Brain Interceptors. The third team will be team C, Jarvis. And the last team will be team I, G4. So kicking off the competition is team L, INNOSIGHT, at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Team L, you will now have 10 minutes to make your presentation. Any members of the team may speak once at a time. Team L, Ivan will give you reminders when there's 30 seconds remaining. Team L, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are Team INNOSIGHT, and today we will present to you the housing and land controversies in Hong Kong and our solutions to the problems. We identify the housing and land issues as a division between the housing demand versus actual housing and residential land supply in Hong Kong. On the demand side, citizens have been struggling to afford housing, and roughly thousands of residents are still suffering from poor housing quality but could hardly access public housing. On the supply side, we notice that only 7% of total Hong Kong land area is under residential use, which could hardly support sufficient housing supply. Meanwhile, as Hong Kong is facing a huge shortfall in public housing supply, we will need transitional housing to support those waiting for public housing in poor living environments. That said, Hong Kong is also short of transitional housing development, having less than 1% of all public housing applicants accommodated. Based on these observations, we argue that the real issue with housing in Hong Kong is about lack of development rather than land. And I will now pass on to my teammates for more detailed diagnosis.
In terms of the root problems, conflicting stakeholder interests between governments will consensus on housing allocation in Hong Kong. Firstly, reliance on land premium reduces government's incentive to push for more public housing. Moreover, the over-funneling of investment into capital reserve fund also lowers public housing potential. Secondly, real estate developers tend to adopt the practice of landholding and delay development of their land banks until infrastructures are available to maximize the profit. Furthermore, the failure of TONG's policy has led to conservative attitude among property owners on increasing housing supply, as they are afraid of plummeting prices in the property market. Thus, the long-standing political deadlock between governments and major stakeholders results in housing inaction.
Secondly, while government's stance has always been the lack of sufficient land, which is why Hong Kong's prioritized land reclamation, Hong Kong's real problem is not a matter of land shortage, but land underutilization. Through our research, we found that Hong Kong is a combination of lands that could potentially be unlocked with the correct policies and initiatives. In the short to midterm, lands such as brownfields, private land banks, and short-term tenancy sites are all generally idle lands or reserved for temporary usage. Notably, unlocking just the brownfield sites of 1,300 hectares alone could potentially house around 1 million people. Combining both short and long-term lands, we get a total of 4,379 hectares of potential land unlocked, amassing a total of almost 3 million units built, which could exceed the 10-year government housing supply target by more than 600%. Therefore, unlocking these underutilized lands will be key to addressing the housing shortage problem in Hong Kong.
Past government intervention has been ineffective. Due to the transfer of sovereignty, Hong Kong lacked a long-term development direction, which leads to poor urban planning and created a deadlock between the logistics and residential land use. With the rigid policies and conflicts of interest, there exists idle lands and brownfields with a low conversion rate. Meanwhile, the government failed to provide enough transitional housing for people living in extreme conditions. With the Land Tile Tomorrow vision, many blame that the land reclamation policy have led to high infrastructure costs and damage to the environment. People expect the project to be delayed and possibly incur billions of additional costs, which makes the plan even less effective. From the above cases, we noticed that the Hong Kong government has been focusing on the big ideas only, while they fail to address the issue realistically.
So let's go through the recommendations. Our first recommendation is to address transitional housing. With a combination of housing unaffordability and extensive wait time for public housing, citizens are pushed to live in housing that do not meet a quality standard of living. Therefore, we recommend providing transitional housing to facilitate immediate relief to residents in urgent need of housing through 3 key phases. Firstly, unlocking short-term housing, developing land-efficient housing, and assessing for further expansion. So these are our recommendations. So on to the next slide. So in terms of short-term lands, we identified short-term tenancy lands that are government land temporarily left idle and leased for short-term use that amounted to 800 hectares. In particular, 158 hectares of this land consist of car parks due to high demand of licensed vehicles that are located in urban areas with pre-existing infrastructure that are attractive for residential development. Therefore, we should specifically target STT car parks while finding a solution to optimize parking space to unlock STT land. So we recommend creating auto parking systems to release these parking spaces. As seen in previous studies on APS, not only do they enhance land use efficiency, government will also be incentivized to invest in the system as it drives profitability due to higher volume of parking spaces. In doing so, approximately 70% of existing 150 hectares will be available for transitional housing units.
Upon opening of key land, innovative housing solutions are necessary to maximize transitional housing efficiency. Currently, the non-CHEUNG modular social housing used modular integrated construction method to build the transitional housing in a short time, which is highly efficient. Inspired by the modular housing scheme, we propose a hybrid mode of both land and sea modular housing projects. For online modular housing, as cargoes are easy to move, we suggest brownfields and idle government lands as locations. As for on-sea part, we propose coastal areas with low tidal range and inner harbors can be used as locations, such as Tai Miu Run and CHEUNG. For land container house, the land selection criteria will be based on transportation, convenience, and access to infrastructure. As container houses can be built in spread locations, brownfield sites with small size are also feasible for development. In total, more than 846 hectares of brownfield and idle lands are capable for use. For sea container houses, based on Netherlands Floating Houses project, we estimate that 1 km square will be suitable for our project. Given that water takes up 59.8% of area in Hong Kong, the large proportion of coastal areas in Hong Kong makes the idea to become feasible.
Next, we develop the short to medium run solutions. And we suggest that the government can adopt the PPP model to unlock the land banks owned by the key developers, which left idle for higher future profits. They locked the high quality land, which can be potentially developed into high density housings. However, developers did not start the project due to the lengthy land premium negotiations and the current high land premium. Thus, we have the underutilized land, which is more than enough to fill the housing land shortfall. Government should review the existing land premium policies and decide on the land premium discount to provide to developers to incentivize earlier developments. And as a result, PPP model can open up the private and areas which provide both private and public housings together with more comprehensive infrastructure in place. There were PPPs implemented in Hong Kong under the British governance. In the 1970s, the Hong Kong invited private developers in Sha Tin New Town development, in which the government provided land premium discount to developers, where they have to perform land reclamation, site reformation, and construction at their own cost based on the government's development plans. However, the PPP in Tin Shui Wai in the 1980s was failed eventually due to the sudden drop in land value in 1982, in which the government has to pay the developers in order to reclaim the land. We believe that it is unlikely to happen again in the near future. The Tin Shui Wai project failed because of the loss of market confidence due to the transfer sovereignty over Hong Kong. However, we can see that the land value was rather stable in the past 10 years, even with the recent political fluctuations and the COVID pandemic.
So in the mid to long term, we would like to introduce transferable development rights, abbreviated as TDRs, to unlock the 1,300 hectares of active brownfield sites and tackle the issues of housing supply and affordability. TDRs were first used in New York City to preserve heritage properties, either natural or man-made. Eligible landowners are granted some TDRs, which allow part or all of the density potential on their land to be transferred to another piece of land or another landowner. The receiving party could then develop their constructions beyond the original limits on height and density so that the land could be of higher use. Over the years, other places have adopted the idea of TDRs and even transformed them beyond its traditional utility. So in particular, the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil has introduced a CPAC system in which TDR exchange does not happen among landowners, but rather between them and the government. Under this system, the government issues CPACs, which is equivalent to TDRs, and sells them to developers, and the revenue would then go to public finance investment. This scheme has proven effective to incentivize urban development, though it has been criticized for not involving the interest of the society and general public. So referring to the Sao Paulo case, we would like to adjust and add on a few features to make it applicable to Hong Kong and directly tackle our housing issues. So First of all, instead of letting government hold all the TDRs for sale, we suggest involving the general public, allocating a piece of land capacity as a TDR to each permanent resident over 18 years old for potential developers and villagers to purchase. Second, development projects involving TDRs could only be used for residential purposes, thus addressing housing supply and affordability. And under this system, all stakeholders would have incentives for promoting housing supply in Hong Kong. Landowners could now build more floors while preserving their land, which helps maximize their profit. And the general public would be willing to sell their TDRs to developers for a greater supply of housing units, which further affects housing affordability. And for the government, they could save billions from land reclamation and result in similar housing supply, thereby creating a triple win situation. And based on Hong Kong's total active brownfield area, domestic plot ratio, and the total adult population, we have estimated roughly 126 square feet capacity of TDRs for each citizen to be distributed in a sustainable manner, one portion at a time. And here are our references, and this is the end of our pitch. Thank you.
Thank you, Team L. Judges and teams, please mark your questions for Team L's presentation, if any. Again, thank you, Team L. Now it's a turn for Team H, Brain Interceptors, at the Education University of Hong Kong. Team H, you will now have 10 minutes to make your presentation. Any members of the team may speak once at a time. Team H, Ivan will give you reminders when there is 30 seconds remaining. Team H, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Team H would like to introduce building consensus for land and housing supply through co-production. We are going to talk about definition, diagnosis, suggestion of land and housing controversy in Hong Kong. How should the problem be defined? Firstly, as seen from the green line in the chart, housing affordability 2004 to 2019, housing in Hong Kong is severely unaffordable compared to other cities. Secondly, land and housing supply in Hong Kong face three types of constraints, which are resource constraints, ideological constraints, and political institutional constraints. The resource constraint, for example, most of the land resource were in the hand of the big property developers, such as Henderson Land Development Company or individual indigenous villagers. The ideological constraints, such as laissez-faire economic philosophy, the political institutional constraint, for example, weak governing capacity versus increasingly fragmented and plural civil society. Lastly, land and housing shortage is both myth and reality. For the myth, it's been said that city can always grow up, even if a city is geographically constrained, or there's no shortage of land for housing in Hong Kong, only a lack of will to act for the people. But in reality, there has not much remained developable land.
What are the root reasons behind? Firstly, even though there are several options of land supply, but each involves the interests of different groups and pros and cons, there's no easy option ahead. Secondly, the government disregards public views and early participation, resulting in the unsatisfactory performance in public-private partnership projects. For example, the failure experience of the West Kowloon Cultural District, the lack of opportunity for small and medium-sized developers to participate, and a failure to be open about the criteria for selecting the successful bid caused the controversies accompanying. Based on the 8 rounds and the leader of citizen participation, the level of citizen participation in most of the land and housing development projects in Hong Kong remains tokenistic without empowering different stakeholders and the lay public. For the case of neighborhood resistant to Nimbai, where neighborhood residents are concerned about the negative impact of new public housing construction on local traffic, services, environment, neighborhood character, and so on, it is found that the new development faces less neighborhood resistance when the neighborhood is included in the process from the very beginning.
Thirdly, the authority pays little attention to the active role of every citizen in shaping the city's development. There are a few aspects. First, favoring the development rights of real estate developers over those of individuals of collectives, and then favoring big developers with financial capability and development experience over their smaller counterparts. In addition, susceptible to regulatory capture in Hong Kong's oligopolistic real estate market. Furthermore, public skepticism of public-private partnership has the transfer of public interests to private hands. The third part is our suggestions, co-production in collaborative land and housing projects. First, co-production. The concept was first coined by Elena Ostrom. The arrangement where individual citizens produce their own services in full or part with public service professionals. It blurred boundary between the professional and the lay citizen, delivering public services in an equal and reciprocal relationship between professionals, people using services, their family, and their neighbors. Second, recognition of the agency, knowledge, and initiatives of individuals or collectives as land and housing owners, occupiers, and users. We've heard about that. Men are from Mars, professionals are from Venus. I'm going to tell an interesting experiment here. A group of volunteer students were shown photographs of unfamiliar people and buildings. We asked to rate the attractiveness. Some volunteers were architects and some were not, where everyone had similar views on people. The architecture and non-architecture students had polarized views on buildings. The architecture students' favorite buildings were everyone else's least favorite, and vice versa. The longer the students study architecture, the more they disagreed with the general public on what constitutes an attractive building. So the story tells us that ordinary citizens sometimes, with better knowledge than state and the professionals about their lived space, community needs, and the concrete obstacles confronting land and housing development initiatives.
Next suggestion is bottom-up strategy of cooperative land readjustment. This can be done by encouraging schemes similar to land sharing pilot scheme. The project is launched by a private company. In other words, this is a bottom-up way which will contribute to a public and private partnership. Also, the voices of people will be heard more. This will increase trust in the government and the satisfaction of people as well. Also, another bottom-up strategy is to allow individuals and civil society groups to negotiate out a solution by themselves because they know what they want rather than the government does. Likewise, the transaction cost and information asymmetries must be reduced as well so the people can make a better decisions. Lastly, build consensus through citizen participations. It is to reduce the misunderstanding and unite all stakeholders and increase trust between each other. Next suggestion is empowering the society to play an active role in land and housing supply. This is because the government is not the omnipotent, so the people themselves can work out a long term. This is a complementary solution. For example, Lightbee. Lightbee is a social enterprise providing alternative housing solutions for low-income families by tapping a spirit of common goodness, like utilizations of vacant properties from willing landlords to provide low-rent accommodation for selected low-income households. To recap, the subsidize or support social enterprise will be beneficial. And the last suggestions, repositioning the government. The government should be repositioned as the facilitator of platform and networks for land and housing planning. To implement this, first, we have to reform the whole land and housing system to enable smaller firms, self-builders, and community groups to take more substantial roles. Second, increase the transparency and information disclosure about land property. Third, develop innovative online consultation and engagement tools for land and housing planning. Lastly, layman-friendly regulations and technical standard. The technical standard in this case is all about technical details related to land and urban planning. Normally, they are monopolized by the professionals like the government and so on. The point of this is the scientific terms should be made comprehensible to the public to allow more interest parties to participate in. Finally, we firmly believe that if we follow these solutions, we can build the consensus to land and housing supply, which will greatly contribute to the land and housing controversy in Hong Kong in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Team H. Judges and teams, please mark your questions for Team H's presentation, if any. Thank you, Team H. Now is the turn for Team C, Jarvis at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Team C, you will now have 10 minutes to make your presentation. Any member of the team may speak once at a time. Team C, Ivan will give you a reminder when there is 30 seconds remaining. Team C, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, judges and other fellow participants. We're Team Jarvis. Housing is not an easy problem to solve. In the course of 24 years, Hong Kong government has made a lot of incremental changes to the housing system. But the price of private housing now is nearly 4 times than it was in 1999. The average waiting time for public rental housing is increasing year by year. These are all indicating that the incremental measures are not at all targeting deep-rooted stakeholder conflicts in Hong Kong. Rather, it is an escape from the reality that we have fewer and fewer feasible land development solutions. In this highly complex issue, our team identified the key problem as delayed land acquisition. Each of the methods on land development have their own constraints in either timeliness or effectiveness. For example, rezoning and urban renewal could not provide a promising supply of land and before reclamation. But the truth is, okay, so for example, rezoning and urban renewal could not provide a promising supply of land and could not be the single most effective solution for our housing dilemma. And let's say brownfields. Environmentalists have always been blaming the government for not developing the brownfields before reclamation. But the truth is, brownfields, which are often fragmented and polluted, and with severe opposition from existing users, will need at least a decade for effective development. And one-off solutions are the most time-consuming. Reclamation and development of country park periphery would take on average 20 years. And needs of land are not solely coming from housing. Hong Kong is crashing into the problems of aging population and severe wealth inequality. And on the other hand, the Chinese government is strongly supporting Hong Kong in becoming the leading INT city in the world. All of these solutions on economic infrastructure and housing needs land. If Hong Kong is still being stuck in unstable and limited land supply, citizens' quality of life and Hong Kong's overall competitiveness could not thrive and catch up with other well-developed economies. Obviously, we are running out of time, but what are the root causes behind time?
Our answer is social consensus and government positioning. Conflict of interest is always observable, yet the problem is the society is unable to move from conflict to consensus. Each interest group is obsessed with its own cost and benefit and declines to see the bigger picture. For instance, rich public rental housing tenants are reluctant to move out due to the inconvenience, even though some of them are financially capable. Outdoor activity lovers hold on to their weekend leisure in the nature, even though the proposed development area might only be a tiny fraction of the entire country park space. And private housing residents opposed to the construction of public housing in their own district as they prefer recreational or transportation facilities and the return of investment from the high property price. These unsettled debates occupy government with lengthened public consultation, protests, and obstruction to construction work, and thereby undermining its determination and ability in implementing the most straightforward and effective solution. While victims continue to agonize and the cost of remedies skyrockets, the government also suffers as it loses public trust and its authority being damaged, making it harder to elicit future collaboration from the community. Just like what happened in the proposed development of the periphery of the country parks in 2017. Surveying and consultancy work were forced to stop as the government subjected itself too heavily to public opinion. And this brings us to the problem of wrong positioning. Housing is a special commodity. It's both a human necessity and at the same time an investment product. Thus, it's an effective tool in correcting social inequality via resource allocation. Yet, the policy implemented do not fully reflect this government intent of basic livelihood protection. For instance, the income and net household asset limits for wealth-off tenants are too high, and these tenants are in fact accumulating a substantial amount of wealth. Government should relocate these resources to those who are truly in need, such as those living in subdivided or nano flats. The primary focus here should not be the enhancements of quality of life when the basic human rights of some are not even secured. As every policy would unfortunately upset someone, the government should shift its focus back to decision-making and adhere to its own governing philosophy. For instance, helping those with appalling living conditions, because it's simply not fair, just, and reasonable to help someone living in a space smaller than 7 square meters in Hong Kong, which is such a wealthy and developed city. Justice delay is justice denied, and members of the public may not be able to empathize or resonate with those who are suffering before and during negotiation, but this is not justifiable for the government.
This forms the basis of our action plan. Our proposed measures are focusing on two main themes: fixing inefficiencies and deliberative democracy. Using the development project of Double Cove in Ma On Shan as an example, we have wasted 2 decades on modifying and negotiating details with developers, and there are more cases in which years have been wasted on land clearance and unclear project scheduling. So in this part of the plan, our first recommendation is to establish a Housing Project Management Council. We aim at addressing the government's weaknesses on project management by clearly defined supervision and communication. Depending on cases, the council should execute the rights to eliminate delays by measures like reducing the offered amount of land premium to knock out the unworthy negotiation process. And second, process reviews. We know that the Development Bureau has set up the steering group on streamlining development control, which drafted a variety of measures on 7 topics related to land development to eliminate unnecessary government processes. But this should not be done by government officials. Officials have their own assigned duties, and oftentimes they could not spot troubles in the system for them being inside the system. So hiring management consultancies could increase the efficiency of process reviews and free up time for officials to deal with more urgent issues. By accelerating development through project management skills and process reviews, we should expect a reduction on implied social costs from time-consuming government processes and address the housing issue as quickly as possible. We cannot wait. And the second part, which is the most important part, the long battle in deliberative democracy. Stakeholders are always affected by rational ignorance. They won't spend time understanding the difficulties that other stakeholders are facing. Therefore, deliberative democracy is the way out. This is different from public consultations. Hong Kong government should then be an observer, mediator, and broadcaster of the process. Stakeholders should be able to understand each other rather than irrationally opposing any plans harming their own interests. Through deliberative democracy, we can also present the most brutal social reality of stakeholder conflicts and unwillingness to help citizens who are not even protected by the basic rights to live. It is only by open communication that we can restore consensus and promote understanding. And the most important thing is, the government could then make the decision based on social justice and sufficient understanding from citizens. This is not a one-time thing. Deliberative democracy is a long-term process, and every moment is a fight towards social harmony. We are not being utopian. This is and should be the way out of controversies in Hong Kong.
And at the end of the day, the land and housing problem is similar to the innovation and technology issue we've dealt with in the previous round. And it definitely has its own specific technical challenges. But the underlying problem is our complex, abstract social and political differences. And as cliched as it may sound, no action plan is perfect and no social problem could be entirely solved. And perhaps rather than being fixated with obstacles, it's more about the entire society together learning how to coexist with the problems and achieving progress in every step of the solution implementation. And more importantly, not diverging our attention from innovating and prospering in Hong Kong's future. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
And here are our references. Thank you.
Thank you, Team C. Judges and teams, please mark your questions for Team C's presentation, if any. Thank you, Team C. Now is the turn for Team I, G4, at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Team I, you will now have 10 minutes to make your presentation. Any member of the team may speak once at a time. Team I, Ivan will give you reminders when there is 30 seconds remaining. Team I, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're Team G4. Our pitch topic today is Institutional and Strategic Redesign, Solution to Land and Housing Controversies in Hong Kong. In the whole pitch, we'll firstly diagnose the current 3 problem of Hong Kong's land and housing construction, then analyze the root cause and give our recommendations in terms of institutional restructure and strategic refocus. The housing problem in Hong Kong has long troubled the public and the government. A housing supply cliff in Hong Kong has now arrived at a doorstep. The city's land bank is depleting, while creating land is becoming harder and harder. Both private and public housing supplies have plugged with no sign of rebound. In the face of the shortage of land and housing, the government has responded positively by setting housing construction goals and corresponding policies. But the problem is that these goals and policies have been in a chronic state of failure to meet their targets. More seriously, the predicted housing demand is actually even underestimated due to the declining household size, aging population, and immigrants. So the gap between housing supply goal and actual supply will continue widen in at least 5 years. Concerning the completion of the existing land policy, the government's planned resumption of idle private agricultural land in the new territories has been stalled for a long time due to the difficulty of implementing the land resumption ordinance. And the public-private partnership program like land sharing pilot scheme, however, the government has not received any formal application yet. In addition to a low level of policy completion, there is also a lack of consensus among the Hong Kong public towards the current land and housing issues. For example, the development of brownfield sites and reclamation land from the sea are continuing opposed by different interest groups and parties. So based on above analysis, the root cause of this problem is that there is a lack of consensus among all Hong Kong people towards this problem, and the Hong Kong government lacks a complete enforcement mechanism to execute land and housing construction goals and policies. Now comes to the recommendation section. Firstly, we suggest an institutional restructure. There are currently 4 obvious shortcomings in the land and housing institution and construction process. The first is the multiplicity and remoteness of institutions. As the 2 graphs suggest, the agencies responsible for town planning, land, and housing in Hong Kong are separated under different authorities. While ensuring the greatest possible comprehensiveness of decision-making, interdepartmental progress is difficult to reconcile as well as poses problems. The second point is the lengthy approval and negotiation process, where the lack of interdepartmental coordination and complex formality often result in projects being stuck between multiple departments for too long. It normally takes 11 to 14 years in total for a project to go from planning until final completion. To use a specific case in point, after obtaining planning permission in 2001, the Riva project in Canting took 4 years to resolve the rezoning negotiation and was completed in 2014, took a total of 13 years.
Thirdly, the institutional setting also reveals a deficiency in the lack of progress assessment of construction projects. Based on data from Long-Term Housing Strategy and Housing Authority, we made this table to show the average housing units required per year to meet LTHS targets and actual numbers completed, and as well as the shortfall between them over the 5-year period from 2016 to 20. In fact, except 2018, all the actual finished housing units in each year were less than target, with the cumulative unfinished housing units over the 5 years reaching around 58,000. This persistent shortfall is not conducive to the achievement of long-term targets, but rather penning up current demands and causing the government to underestimate future demands. The fourth shortcoming lies in the setting up of repeated public participation segments, not only at the town planning stage, but also at the land usage conversion and approval stages, involving environmental protection, transportation, and various aspects of infrastructure, which are often rather time-consuming. But in practice, public consultation at the planning stage has already been long and comprehensive enough. For example, in Yuen Long South Plan's public consulting, it lasted for 3 years, and the subsequent collection of public views and hearings at the approval stage and later may be redundant. In contrast to this, public transparency on the progress of the project during its construction is absent, resulting in a lack of accountability as monitoring of project relies solely on the government. Therefore, based on the above diagnosis and the 4 issues identified, our team proposes the following recommendations. Firstly, to create short-term task forces for specific development projects, consisting of personnel from planning, land, housing, and other departments, and experts outside administration, which will provide one-stop advice and approval for projects, integrate procedures and indicators as much as possible, and thus facilitate cross-departmental collaboration and avoid the need to switch between different procedures. Secondly, splitting up the Transport and Housing Bureau and creating a dedicated Housing Bureau to handle the matter, and this will concentrate the resource input. Thirdly, the government should regularly review and evaluate projects' progress, account to the public and the legislature for failures in meeting annual targets, and set up compensatory plans and establish accountability. Fifthly, public opinion gathering should be completed as early as possible in the planning stage and to avoid follow-up repeated collections. On the other hand, an information platform should be set up to allow the public to monitor the progress of construction projects and to increase social supervision.
So apart from redesigning the institutions to increase the efficiency, we also believe there's a need to modify the government's land and housing strategy to build consensus in the society. So current strategy separates different initiatives and prioritize the least controversial options to develop. This may be efficient in the short run, but it's not helpful for building consensus in the society. All the development options should be considered and debated as an interacting and also organic whole. For example, the brownfield development research stated that the sites that are not suitable for housing for different reasons, but if we actually consider nearby private lands or logistics and warehouse and all the other things together, and they can actually supplement these projects and increase the utilization of the brownfield sites. Therefore, next slide, please. Therefore, on the one hand, we suggest to develop a SAR level control plan for brownfield developments. As mentioned in the previous case study, if we consider all brownfields and surrounding lands together, we can develop a more strategic plan for their functions and development plans instead of neglecting their potential. 151 hectares of land that got vetoed in the brownfield development research can be reconsidered, no matter as housing, logistic clusters, or land reserves. On the other hand, we also suggest setting up a more comprehensive plan to tackle private land reserves. We appreciate the government's endeavor to enhance public-private cooperation in LSPS. However, we need to clarify its relationships with other stricter policies. By setting up an application deadline for LSPS before actually invoking land resumption ordinance, we hope to provide both incentive and also pressure for private land developers to take up their social responsibility and utilize land resources.
Under the same principle to consider all land development options as a whole strategically, we also see the necessity to advance large-scale reclamation projects, such as the Land for Tomorrow vision. However, the existing policy cannot guarantee the fast progress of this project. The main pressure comes from resistance of environmental protection organizations who think the work will break the ecosystem equilibrium. And some question whether such extravagant budget is waste of resources and will exhaust the fiscal treasury. And thus some society groups and councillors have been consistently opposing the Land for Tomorrow project. But we think the government should persist in changing people's life for the better. And let me name a few of the advantages of this project. Firstly, and most importantly, it can provide up to 260,000 of residential units, and of which 70% will be used as public housing. And this will result in increasing land and housing supply, improving people's life quality. Secondly, it creates considerable economic and social benefits, such as numerous job opportunities. Moreover, the secret reclamation will elevate the willingness of property developers to speed up the pace on new residential community development, which is why we consider the building of Land for Tomorrow is necessary. There can be several ways for reaching the consensus of whole society, like mass debate or referendum. So the preliminary result is shown that people who reject the Land for Tomorrow project has outnumbered those who support. So government may use positive propaganda with accurate statistics to convert the public opinion. A huge amount of Hong Kong people may not realize the long-term benefits of this project by now, and it is government's responsibility to convince them and get their support. To wrap up, starting with institutional reform ended with strategic implementation, our recommendation of policies is based on a systematic public policy cycle. As shown in this timeline, we propose that in the short run, the government should review existing institutions.
Thank you, Team I. Judges and teams, please mark your questions for Team I's presentation, if any. Huge thank you to the teams for your presentation. We're now going to provide you a 10-minute preparation for the debates. Each team will be given 10 minutes to prepare the questions based on the pitches delivered by other participating teams. The question prepared will be asked during the debate sessions. Without further ado, the countdown will start now. Thank you, team, for your dedication in the preparation. And now we are going to commence the structured debate session. As a reminder, each team will be given 1 minute to ask one question to another participating team regarding their pitches, and also according to sequential order. Each team will be given no more than 1 minute to ask the question and no more than 3 minutes for the answers. There will be a 30-second reminder for the response. As an example of the logistic, Team L will ask a question to Team H, and Team H will respond in 3 minutes. So without further ado, Team L, please raise your question to Team H.
Hi, thank you, Group H. So for our question, in your recommendation on co-production, we want to clarify on 2 key aspects. Firstly, we want to clarify whether the scheme you're pushing forward, which is similar to the land sharing pilot, involves public sector housing, as we are aware that the current scheme involves developers providing 70% of land to facilitate public sector housing, or is it simply a market for private sector housing transactions? Secondly, we want to clarify on the government's role in the scheme. If individuals and civil society groups are free to negotiate amongst themselves, what can the government do to prevent creation of a housing black market? Thank you.
Thank you, Team L. May Team H address their question?
So I would first like to answer the second question first. So if we allow the individuals group to negotiate out themselves, so what the government can do, right? So the government can provide platform or network for them, because this is to make sure that the information asymmetry will not happen in the system. So when they have enough knowledge, when they know about each other well, so they can negotiate out, because the housing problems, it's not just about housing, it's not just about home buying, right? There are 2 main parts, which is the house buying and the rental one, because if we focus only for the housing one, so there are also a group of people who has to rent a house. They cannot buy their own house. They have to rent a house as well. So in this case, it can support the people who can rent a house to negotiate with the landowners, with the accommodation owners, and the government can be a platform, can be a consultant, and provide a platform or network from them to make it more negotiation between them. Yeah, and yeah. So
And for the first question, so you mentioned about the co-production, and the co-production means to blur the boundary between the professional and the lay citizen. So that which means we need to have both of them opinion and get together and let each other to understand to understand, so that the opinion will works for the government. The government will know that, okay, so everyone, they have the consensus that will be more efficient and more acceptable for the whole society and the government to facilitate the progress of the housing problem.
And for the first questions that you asked, the project like land pilot schemes, it is the project that it is an example to show that this should not be the government duty, is only the private sector and society. They can help each other as well to solve this problem. For example, social enterprise, or the project that initiated by the private, they can use their own land, and then they cooperate with the government to provide more accommodation to the people, things like that. So it could be done from not just for the government, the others can do as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Team H. So without further ado, Team H, please raise your question to Team C.
Thank you. Our question is, Team C, you mentioned that the consensus is important to solve the housing problem, and suggested to improve the public participation via stakeholders selection with a specific target, but not the general public. If so, the initiative will be always handled in the government and the minority. Do you think the general public is not important to the public consensus? Here's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Team H. May Team C address that question?
Yes, thank you for your question. We understand that the general public is also involved in land and housing policy, but then what we believe in our action plan is that we need to prioritize those who are most impacted by government policy, such as those living in subdivided flats, the property developers. These are the ones that are affected the most by government's action, and the general public may not have sufficient information or adequate sympathy or empathy towards those who are being affected the most. For instance, if we are living in decent residence, how are we able to resonate with those living in very tiny, small, and appalling living conditions? So we believe the importance in targeting specific groups and have them to involve in direct and open discussion so that the rest of the public will be more aware of the scenario they are in and position themselves in their shoes. Thus, when we come to sacrificing certain interest groups' benefits, we are more able to understand and to agree with the government when they are making these decisions based on the pros and cons of different policies.
Thank you, Team C, for your answer. Now, without further ado, Team C, please raise your question to Team I.
Our team agrees with your problem definition and root causes, while your action plan mainly focuses on the institutional reforms to expedite the process. But then the current government actually do not lack solutions to increase land supply or speed up internal delay. The problem is more about it being reluctant to disappoint any stakeholders when the consensus could not be reached. So we would like to ask, if this consensus cannot be reached, how would you advise the government? And in terms of balancing the trade-off between stakeholders, what is your selection criteria? And how do you settle the disappointment or anger of the upset parties? Thank you.
Thank you, Team C. May Team I address that question?
So thank you for your question. Firstly, well, what we want to say is that, of course, the governments may be reluctant to address like the different opinions from different contradictory parties, but we would like to also be, we are also firmly believe in that the government also have the willing is also willing to solve this problem. So I think we know that we think that the government is well aware of this contradictory. So they want to solve this problem, but if they really have to endeavor into this question, they need to harm the some of the stakeholders, let's say. And that is why we propose our two main strategies. Firstly is some institutional restructure. This is to empower the government to have more coverage and also political power to really address different opinions from the society, and also allow the society to monitor the governments in a more transparent way. And we believe this can alleviate some anger from different society, because these angers may just be misunderstandings because they have misunderstandings about the government's policy. And for our second strategy, we focused on strategic refocus. And this is for us to really, help us to for the government to really look at the whole bunch, whole spectrum of voices from the public, and based on amendment and also based on prioritization to really pivot for some policies that are less controversy and that can align with the most publics. We understand that, of course, that even under our strategies, there will still be some parties that feel their interests are harmed, but we have to admit that that's the reality in society. So there are many other issues on top of land and housing. Maybe there are other economic developments, and maybe there are other political or social welfare programs. That's the area that we can compensate for some parties that their concerns are not that well addressed in our land and housing policies. So we need to consider the policies for the government as a whole.
And I want to add on that, because the scenario you proposed is only one possibility, that the stakeholders are reluctant to do so. But sometimes stakeholders are willing to do so, but they are somehow just delayed by the process being too slow. So that's why we propose a concise approval and a negotiation process through institutional settings and strategic refocus.
Thank you, Team I, for your response. So now, Team I, please raise your question to Team L.
Team L, so thank you for your presentation. Your team has introduced many case studies overseas, but we would like to know the practicality of these policies in Hong Kong. Specifically, we have two concerns. So firstly, you introduced the TDR mechanism in New York City, but the total conversion area for this mechanism is 185,000 square meters in 37 years. And this is equivalent to 4,000 housing units built in 37 years. Do you think this is enough to like compare to the huge demand gap in Hong Kong? And secondly, our concerns for the high-rise car parks, there is contradiction for the choice of land for construction. Because if we build it in like a city downtown, maybe the developers are more willing to build like office buildings, shopping malls, and other buildings. But if you build like high-end parking buildings in like remote areas, there will not be enough demand to serve its purpose. So given Hong Kong's like, how do you make these policies be effective in Hong Kong?
Thank you, Team I. May Team L address that question?
Thank you for your question. So regarding your first question about the practicality of the STDR scheme in Hong Kong, we think that because you mentioned New York conversion area is really large. However, in Hong Kong, we have over 1,300 hectares of active brownfield sites, which could be developed into high density housing units. And the scheme that we are basing on, we are planning to allocate the land capacity of these total 1,300 hectares of brownfields based on the regulations on the maximum domestic plot ratio in Hong Kong, and then with the total area capacity, we would allocate all of these. We would divide these TDRs to each citizen, but we are not allocating them all at once, but one portion at a time, and to incorporate the needs at each, like the current needs of Hong Kong housing. And for the second question about.
Yes, so firstly, I just want to address like sort of the demand for these automated parking systems. So we can definitely say that firstly, in the 10 years between 2006 and 2016, the total number of licensed vehicles in Hong Kong has continued to increase with a growth rate of 35% from 550,000 to almost 750,000. So therefore, there is a constant demand for parking spaces, which is also a reason why parking spaces are so expensive. And therefore, while it's arguable that we are facing an issue in terms of the convenience of these, but in reality, if we are actually looking in the sense that in the long term, we also provide prestigious transitional housing and also the additions of its existing infrastructure that in the long term may eventually be made into public housing infrastructure as well. Therefore, we can account for that fact, and therefore there will actually be people living in this area and therefore are conveniently accessible to these car parking spaces, and therefore are able to maximize the land usage here.
Yeah, and I would also like to address that we are not relying on our public housing supply solely on the long-term use of transferable development rights, as it is a very long-term process. We would like to address public housing primarily with our land readjustment and releasing plan first. And for the TDRs, we would like to, so to sum up, we have both midterm and long-term plans for addressing housing needs in both public and private sectors. So thank you.
Okay, thank you teams for your active participation in a structured debate session. Now we will proceed to the free debate. Again, as a reminder, each team will be given 1 minute to ask one question to any one specific team of their choices regarding their pitch. The team being asked the question will be offered a response in 3 minutes right after the question was raised. There will be a 30-second reminder for team response. To start with, will Team L first mention the team that you would like to address the question to?
Thank you. So we would like to address a question to Team C.
Team C, you have a question coming up from Team L.
Thank you. So we find your initiatives on communication process good, but we are concerned whether solving institutional efficiency can rapidly fix the issue of housing affordability. So as you mentioned, people are living in subpar living conditions right now and urgently require aid. Will fixing bureaucratic inefficiencies and setting up a democratic platform address this issue you emphasized on initially? Finally, if this dialogue were successfully established, what initiatives would be created to address this problem you addressed in your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Team L. May Team C address that question?
Yes. I would answer the question on the high property price first. Firstly, we think that it's a really demand supply problem. So if we are able to provide more land for development, then this would already be solved, as in we improve the efficiency of the government internally, as well as trying to expandite the consensus reaching among the society. So this would be a way for us to alleviate the problems. Moreover, on the other hand, is that we know that public housing and private housing, their market have their own efficiency, and we cannot fully tackle this problem because we always need more. And even though we already own a housing, we always want to upgrade our house to better, higher quality standards. So it's more important for us to comfort the community and let them know that actually the government is working on this. And Henry, do you want to address the second part?
Yeah, sure. And I think that the importance of process review is based on the fact that the government is actually very weak in terms of project management. And these two suggestions are linked to each other. And what I mean is that there are several public housing developing projects out there, which are hindered by the processes, which includes like land clearance, which they could not foresee. There is a need of land clearance in prior, which they could not reallocate some piece of land for facilities like firefighting places. And I think the problem right here is about processes. And as Bianca has said, like if we can improve the process, we would eventually be having a very large amount of housing units be available for the population in need, such as the residents of subdivided flats that we have mentioned. Yeah.
And for the suggestion that you are asking if a consensus can be reached, we'll probably propose to allow public housing ownership. So instead of going through the public rental housing and to transit to private market or other sort of house ownership, we'll directly allow the public to purchase public housing, because we noticed that for the PRH actually, many of them are reluctant to move out because of the inconvenience and of the high cost, as exemplified in the well-off tenants policy. So we'll probably address this if we can reach consensus. Thank you.
Thank you, teams. Now it's a turn for Team H. Team H, will you first mention the team that you would like to address the question to?
Yes, thank you. We would like to ask Team L.
Team L, you have a question coming up from Team H.
Okay, even if the land is sufficient, but it doesn't mean that everyone would be able to afford it. So which group of people would gain the benefits from the sufficient land? Because housing problem in Hong Kong is not just about land, as everyone knows. So how this contributes to all classes of people, such as low income or middle income people, or how it helps low income people to have their own home. Thank you.
Thank you, Team H. May Team L address that question?
Just to clarify, in the sense that we're tackling, so what income groups are we catering? So I think this is an important question that I think firstly, we tackle definitely the low income households, because transitional housing units for people who currently are living in caged homes and subdivided apartments. So that was one of our primary concerns. And secondly, we also in the mid to long term, we want to open up through the TDR initiative, as well as the use of a PPP model. We want to open it up so that we were able to facilitate greater establishment of public sector infrastructure and housing. And therefore, these are the sort of income groups we're tackling, because at the end of the day, we want to protect lower income households who are currently waiting in line for public housing, and therefore address the housing shortage that we diagnosed in our presentation.
Thank you, teams. Now it's the turn for Team C. Would Team C first mention the team that you would like to address the question to?
Yes, of course. We would like to ask Team L INNOSIGHT. Thank you.
Team L, you have a question coming up from Team C.
Right. You have made a great presentation, and we agree that we should encourage land acquisition in any means possible and effective. However, your team has mentioned the proposal of land premium discounts, which our team disagrees with the idea, which could potentially worsen the land stocking behaviors of large land developers. Each year, developers are making tremendous profits from land development by intentionally investing and retaining developable lands. The idea of land premium discounts actually increase their bargaining power in land release and blackmails the government for more profits. Do you think this is a justifiable idea when considering its feasibility, policy cycle, and potential public outrage? Thank you.
Thank you, Team C. May Team L address that question? Team L, I think you're on mute.
So just to address this particular question, I think, thank you so much, Team C. I think in terms of this sort of partnership that we're talking about, because I understand the concerns for the particular outrage that could occur from this sort of public-private partnership, but we believe that with the correct incentive, in the long run, it will facilitate a good transaction, because at the end of the day, it's a win-win situation whereby by facilitating this partnership and providing them this sort of discount, we're able to generate this public housing infrastructure that is able to provide this housing for key lower income groups and citizens and residents that are in demand of it. And in doing so, at the same time, private developers are also able to benefit quite a lot. We actually have a public-private housing model assumption that we've made in our appendix, where, for example, by supplying 50%, we're ultimately able to still provide 40% profit for developers. And therefore, in doing so, we actually believe that the developers are still incentivized ultimately in the long run to run this partnership. And we do not have a particular concern of blackmail in this particular situation.
Thank you, teams. Now it's the turn for Team I. Team I, would you first mention the team that you would like to address the question to? Team I? I think you're on mute.
We would like to direct the question to Team C.
Team C, you have a question coming from Team I.
So as you mentioned, we want to ask how to deal with the conflicting interests of different stakeholders you mentioned and their contradictions with the concept deliberative democracy. To put it in other words, if the concept deliberative democracy is used to deal with the civil society consensus and government relations, how the introduction of this concept into the market mechanism actually maybe worsen the social division. So given the already difficult consensus between citizens and between citizens and developers themselves, so it is difficult to see how this can be achieved. So could you detailedly explain the mechanism between?
Thank you, Team I. May Team C address that question?
Right, so I'll be answering the question. And I think the idea of deliberative democracy is effective, as in it could raise awareness of the public in the first place. And second, to let different stakeholders know what are the situation of other stakeholders and what are the interests between. And I think one of the disadvantage of the current model of public consultation of the government right now is that the communication is only one way, and one stakeholder has no incentive to know about what other stakeholders are thinking and what are their concerns. And through deliberative democracy, we incentivize them to know about what other stakeholders are thinking and to know about their pain, and so as to discuss what are the plans to prioritize. Like your team has mentioned, like a strategic plan where we could incentivize and prioritize some of the plans instead of the others, like prioritize brownfields instead of reclamation. And this is the original purpose of deliberative democracy. And we have a few characteristics in between which could manifest the purpose. And I think one of the most worthwhile to mention idea is that we would have broadcasting and raw footages calling for empathy so as to raise public awareness. And as you can see, we aim at triggering empathetic sentiments towards some suffering parties right now in Hong Kong, like residents of subdivided flats. And we would like the public to know about their situation. And we would like them to be empathetic towards their situation. Yeah, Bianca, do you have anything to say?
I think the problem we are trying to raise is that as every team has mentioned, there's always conflicts of interest, and government is not a facilitator. It's not just about allowing different stakeholders to talk and to communicate. It's about him being the one to decide what is the future of the society and what should be our prioritization. For instance, our team emphasized on the protection of basic human rights. Like, how do we justify ourselves not developing the country park when there are people that suffer from appalling living conditions, people who need to live on the street? So by really involving the stakeholders, having them to talk face to face, we would be able to prohibit such negative sentiments and really help us to be okay with the sacrifice we have to make as an individual.
And eventually, we want to deliver the message of social justice to every stakeholder in the society. Yeah.
Thank you, teams, for your insightful questions and witty answers. Following is a Q&A round for judges. As a reminder, judges will ask a question to one or more participating teams. There is no time limit to a question or an answer, as long as it does not exceed the duration of this Q&A session. Teams are not allowed to share screen in this session. Now, judges, what question do you have for our teams?
Let me ask a general question and see whether the four groups would like to respond to it. All groups have mentioned various means to secure more land, to release more land. But in terms of the near term, because you are thinking about what government should do, and realistically, we are talking about sitting government, which has only a few years time of service. So given that need for a sitting government, what would you think to be the most immediate solution that will help to solve the problem to some extent? In other words, what you have said, some of them are more long-term. So if we are talking about the short term, what will be the preferred approach?
Thank you, Professor Choi. This is a question directed to all teams. I would like to proceed it in sequential order. So it will be followed by Team L, H, C, and I. Now, Team L, you will first address the question.
So regarding the short-term immediate solution, so we suggest that the government could expand the social modular housing. So as we can see from the current case study on Lan Chong Street, so we can see that actually by the private-public collaboration on building a very efficient modular integrated construction model. So transitional housing could be built very efficiently and at low cost. So by expanding the modular social housing to a greater scale and providing more subsidies to the private sector, so we believe that the government could alleviate the tension faced by the low-income household and those who live in subdivided flats. So, and then we propose that the government should review and also assess which land to open up more land to provide alternative housing and innovative housing for alleviate the housing tension faced by Hong Kong people. Yeah, so yeah.
We would also like to emphasize that this modular housing is not just a short-term solution, but we understand that there's a there's a short-term needs, and so we are providing the modular housing in a very short period of time. But then we believe that this kind of housing can be extended to the long run, because it can be used for more than like 20 or 30 years. And but our goal is not to use that as the long-term solution yet, because we're not sure the feasibility or what will the citizens think if we use this kind of model housing. So we believe that this term of government can first implement this and maybe try it for a few years and get some feedbacks from the citizens and decide whether it can be a more long-term solution.
Thank you, Team L, for your response. Now it's the turn for Team H.
So I would first suggest to prioritize the risk, because in the short term, we should focus on the one who are really in trouble first, because in the long term it takes time. But while we are still waiting for the long term policy or the project to be implemented, during this period, there are also people who doesn't have home, who are still in trouble with this. So the first, it is better to prioritize the risk or do the risk assessment, and then to go to collect the information at the locals. Try to talk to the people or the stakeholders to gain more insights in order to make a better decision or design a better policy that can solve the problem at the heart of the problems. And in the short term, it is better to cooperate with the private sector, because they are more flexible and they are fast to solve the problems, because the government, they have a bureaucratic system which take too long in order to make decisions, and it's maybe too late to solve the problem for the people who are really in trouble. The government should focus on the low income people first, because they are more in trouble, and they can be a consultant, just like we present. They can provide more information in online platforms and build up the network for them to help each other and gain more, give them or provide them the consult or information that can help them to be in the better decisions. And that's my answer.
And
Thank you.
I'd like to add something here. So we cannot focus on the short-term solutions, because every short-term solutions will hurt the long-term benefits. So that we have to build the trust for the government and let they see that the mass opinion value. So that takes time. It's worthwhile. So that's what I want to add.
Thank you, Team H. Now it's a turn for Team C.
Yes, when it comes to short-term solution, we would consider redevelopment and urban renewal, especially the industrial area in Hong Kong, because there are a lot of factories or these sort of areas that actually do not derive a lot of economic values, and they, relatively speaking, they impact the rest of the society less severely comparing to other sort of interest group. And besides this sort of industrial land use, we also propose that the government to review any property or flats that are actually empty. For instance, there may be some Hong Kongers actually, they have moved to mainland China to work, but they still own some private housing in Hong Kong. So how can we secure this sort of already available flats and to move it to those that are actually in need?
And I would like to add on. I think, speaking in heart, I think every term of government should not only be looking for a short-term solution, which blurs the focus of developing long-term solution. And I would say we start conversation right now based on deliberative democracy. That is what is in my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Team C. Now it's the turn for Team I.
Thank you. Talking about the short-term limits and the most immediate impacts that can be produced effectively, we presented you the most immediate solution, that is the government self-resolution, also known as institutional redesign. Because with the most immediate impacts, when the approval process can be immediately switched to a much faster speed, and when the more resources can be put into the task forces and dedicated bureau, which can be realized probably in 1 or 2 years' time with the support of current legislature, which is more convenient for the government to conduct these deeds. And only when this process can be facilitated, all those above said by different groups, whether it's providing housing for the low-income groups or urban renewal, all this process can be conducted or carried out in a faster speed and in a faster pace. And that's something that can be effective immediately. And also, Victoria, would you like to add on?
Yes. So given that it is almost impossible to develop new land and finish construction of new housing in a very short period of time, we suggest the government to reintroduce the tenant purchase scheme and to increase the home ownership scheme quota, since most residents living in the public rental housing may not afford private housing. So this scheme is to allow as many citizens as possible to buy public housing at affordable prices. And this solution is to first address the problem of Hong Kong residents' difficulty in purchasing houses and to improve their living environment.
Yes, for the sitting government, there's not really much thing that can do to like drastically or just directly finish for like like solve the problem for good. So we have to take transitional measures, and like what other groups said, we renovate the abandoned factory and increase the efficiency and efficacy of existing housing, and giving pensions to those poor people who cannot afford private housing, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, teams. Now we would like to invite a special guest, Professor Wenfeng Tang, Head of the Division of Social Science in HKUST, to ask questions.
Okay, thank you for your presentations. I really enjoyed every one of them, and they're fascinating. I learned so much. I already sent to everyone my 2 questions, but I realized it would take too much time. So James, I'm okay if you just want to pick the question you want to answer. Basically, the first question is, why are you so confident that your proposal will work? If so many people tried for so many years, right? They're smart people. Those people, they know Hong Kong so well, but they failed. So I guess this question I really want to know is, do you see anything in common? Originally, I was thinking, what is the main obstacle facing this problem, right? So if you want to answer this question, probably you should focus on this common problem that made all the people, so smart people, fail. Since Dong Hua, right? Since the 90s, people try to solve the problem. And the second problem, the second question is, if you want to focus on the last part of the question, do you think a piecemeal solution would be more effective, or do you think a comprehensive approach is a good approach? Because if you think about agricultural land, it sounds like very different from land hoarding by developers, right? I think, did anyone talk about land, what's that called? Tianhai, landfill. So it seems like there are different sources for the problem. If you have just a single approach, can that really be used to solve all these different problems?
Thank you, Professor Tang. Again, for our teams, we will address that in sequential order. So first, we'll begin with Kim L.
Thank you for your question. We would like to address question 1 first. What makes us so confident when so many smart people tried? Actually, we like to raise the PPP as our example. As I just mentioned, that the PPP scheme actually was working in the Shatin New Town project, but failed in 1980s in Tin Shui Wai. It was mainly because of the price drop due to some political reasons. But we noticed that the macro environment actually changed, and we can now see that from the slides that I just showed, we can see that the land pricing has been very stable in recent years without the although there was some political fluctuations and also the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the key is that the macro environment actually changed, and some policies that failed in the past may work now. And about the common thing of the failures, we think that the past Hong Kong government actually lacked a very big vision, as they were just a colonial government, and they know that their term will end after 99 years of rulings. And the current Hong Kong government after the takeover actually failed because they usually have a very big vision, big idea, usually from the mainland China government, but they do not really know how to address the real problem in Hong Kong. They do not know how to address the problem that really faced by the citizens. Yeah.
And in response to the second question, we do think that a piecemeal solution would not be enough to tackle all of these sources of problems for Hong Kong's housing crisis. Therefore, we have we have introduced from short to long-term solutions to tackle each of the sources. So for example, for short-term transitional modular housing, we are tackling housing quality of those living in subdivided units and helping with the problems left by the shortage in public housing at the current time. And for our second solution, we suggest land releasing, which would address the problem with residential land supply shortage and the shortage in public housing units in general. And the last solution about TDRs, which is transferable development rights, we would want it to tackle, for a long-term solution, to tackle the general housing unit supply and affordability in Hong Kong, including both public and private housing. And moreover, the TDR scheme will also be able to help with resolving the conflicting interests among different stakeholders, as under the TDR system, both including the government, the developers, and landowners, as well as the general public, would all have incentives to promote housing supply in Hong Kong together. That's why, so yeah, to sum up, we do think that one single solution would not be enough to tackle all of these problems, and we would want a more comprehensive scheme to tackle each. Thank you.
Thank you, Team L. Now is the turn for Team H.
Thank you for the question. So we believe that if we have the public consensus and we can help the public housing problem in Hong Kong, like so now the government tries so many approaches to solve this wicked problem. So, and then we found that the government tried to use the land and they have some opposite and agreement with that thing. So we believe that if we have that consensus, like using the bottom-up strategy, and we can help to solve this problem.
And for the second, we do learn something from the historical experience. For example, the familiar experience of the West Kowloon Cultural District. This project caused many controversies because of the lack of the opportunity for the small size and medium-sized developers to participate, and the failure to be open. People and citizens don't know the criteria for selecting the successful bid, and the government and the big developers just do it. So from this case, we just learned something about we need to take account in the public participation for the better consensus, so that we can go ahead for solving the housing problem. That's all. Thank you.
Another thing is we have to try something new, because like what a wise man said, that Albert Einstein said, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? So we may need to try something new. In the past, so many smart people, they have tried to solve this problem, but they fail. So maybe we have to try something new from this, maybe a stupid perspective, because smart people, they can see in a smart view, but sometimes the problem is not can be solved from the smart people. Sometimes you have just look for something more simple to solve the problems. So this is why we strongly recommend the government to reposition as the educators, so they can educate people and provide the insight to them, so they can have a more data for the decision-making process, and they can contribute to the public opinion, and then maybe they can contribute to the public policy to design a policy that can solve the problem in the future. Sometimes it is really basic. We don't have to looking for something so smart. So that's maybe the reasons why the smart people in the past they failed, because sometimes we can just do the normal things, but we didn't think that it is too normal, and maybe we overlooked that the normal solutions cannot solve the answers. So to sum up, I think sometimes normal things like educating people and it can be the answer, and the government is one of the most important database of the country, so they should be the one who educate the people of their own countries. That's why we suggest in presentation like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Team H. Now it's the turn for Team C.
Right. I would like to address the first question. Honestly, we have no big confidence in our proposal. Like, deliberative democracy is not an easy thing to do. But what we should focus on is to make progress, and I agree to Team H. Like, research and try anything possible under consensus and support from the public. And public consensus and support is an emotional thing. Like, it is about understanding and empathy against material interests. For example, I believe there are very little population, proportion of population who knows exactly how many people are living in subdivided flats, like 200,000 people right now. And how worse are their living conditions. That's why we should communicate and promote understanding of all stakeholders. And that's why deliberation is a must-do task, which reduces opposition from stakeholders in the society. Yeah, and that is my message.
And for the second part for the question, I would say that it's definitely comprehensive because, like, besides all of our elaboration on consensus reaching, policy affect each other and they may undermine the effectiveness of our policy. For example, some suggested that we can directly impose a market ceiling in the unit rental or property price in the private property market. But then, in fact, many citizens are counting on the high property price to pay off the mortgage or to potentially make a return from investing in property. If we have the property price plummeted, the property itself turn to liability, and it would in turn create another source of social problems. So unless we seek external help, say like some suggested that we can ask for land from the mainland China, and then we reallocate part of the population to there and develop some of the infrastructure. Otherwise, if we're talking about solutions within the society, and amount is definitely comprehensive measurements would be more direct and effective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, team. Now, to ensure the fairness in the Q&A session, for the next two questions, we will conduct the session. If the question is directed to all teams, we will conduct that in a reverse order. So for the remaining judges, do you have any questions for any specific teams?
Okay, may I ask Team C? Okay, so actually you talked about, okay, so we need to build a consensus, okay, for, okay, so the housing or land controversy in Hong Kong. Okay, so what kind of consensus actually we need to build? Okay, secondly, okay, you mentioned about the long lead time for housing development in Hong Kong, so it is a problem. But it seems to me that, okay, building consensus, okay, could take time, okay, take a long time. So how can you, okay, strike a balance between, okay, so shortening time of the housing development, but at the same time, okay, getting consensus, public consensus, okay, for the controversy?
Yeah, I think I can answer this question. I think in the short term, there are definitely more feasible options than deliberative democracy, like building more transitional housing. But what we are trying to talking about right now is, like, for example, there is a study of developing the periphery of country parks in Hong Kong in 2017, but that research is abandoned simply because that most of the public is against the idea and they think that, oh, I need to go hiking. And yeah, they're against the idea simply based on that, the fact that they don't understand about how urgent is the land controversy in Hong Kong and how worse is the situation right now in like Shamsher Po, like the subdivided flats. And I think we need to see the long term, right? And we need to resolve like stakeholder conflicts and we need to let them know what is the most important thing to do. And this is also part of the civil education. And we want, our team would like to address that. Yeah, Bianca, do you have anything to say?
And in terms of the prioritization, like ultimately, what is the criteria for government to make a decision, like whose interests to protect, whose to abandon? I would say that, I mean, for our team, we would be focusing on the minimum living quality condition. Like we have actually suggested an example in our slides that when it comes to public rental housing, for those who have accumulated a certain amount of wealth, as in perhaps they have already reached 50% of the original stipulated asset limit, we should have them like try not to forcefully remove them, but we need to invite them to leave the original housing and really free up those spaces for those who are in need. So our priority is not increasing the living quality of the entire population, but becoming a safety net for those who suffer the most during the negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a technical issue just now. We would like to have Team I to address the questions that was raised by Professor Tang just now.
Sure. So thank you, Yvonne. And regarding the first question, Professor Wen has just raised, to be very frank, like also with the other team just mentioned, we are not like that's 100% confidence for our proposed strategies. And I believe so do the previous smart people or policymakers, because in public policy, actually no one can be confident, let's say, for their policy before they really put them into the real society, because society is really complicated. That's also raised to our first point about why the previous attempts failed. And I think the first reason is the socioeconomic situation changes really rapidly, and for all the especially for land and housing policy, you need adjustments and amendments constantly. So what our previous policy had in common is that they lack some sort of perseverance. Let's say maybe when you put up this strategy, the society feels very great about it, but maybe after 1 year, the economic situation changed, and then there started to appear some controversies, and then maybe the government had to drop it or delayed it, postponed it indefinitely. So in this case, that's why the previous policy really cannot reach this full effect, because if we're talking about land and housing policy, that's really long-term strategies, and that's the consensus of this is not discussed, but rather gradually built in the society. So that time span is definitely longer than the term of government, which is 5 years. So that is why I think the previous policy, they felt one of the reasons in common is that they didn't have the perseverance to persist the strategy for longer and keep amending it based on the new society environments. And that is why then that's also one reason for that is that the government is just for 5 years and they don't want to care about what the previous governments actually thought about. So I think that's what we have to focus on in the future.
Yes, if the problem was accumulated like a snowball over the past 20 or 30 years, then we cannot come to solve the problem over one night. It's destined to be a long-term problem. For example, we don't want to repeat Dong Chihuahua's mistake, drastically increase housing supply and housing prices go down, and stakeholders are not happy about that. So we need to do it step by step, and we need to consider the long term.
And also I want to add on that I think the Hong Kong's current housing problem is not something that can only be solved by wisdom, but require great courage. I have no offense, but I think the reality is that many politicians are often refraining from adventurous measures for fear of their political future. And in fact, the lack of the strong policy and enforcement mechanism is one of the most important impediments to solving Hong Kong's current housing problem. And it is also the common of the past failure. So as we presented before, I think Hong Kong law already has a very detailed policies, but its lack of the strong way to meet these targets is the most important problem.
Thank you, Team C, for your address to Dr. Yao's question, and thank you, Team I, for answering to Professor Tang's question. For now, we have 15 minutes remaining for the Q&A session for judges. So, judges, do you have any specific questions to any teams?
Hi, can I ask something? Thank you very much for the presentation. Each one of the groups did an excellent job. So whoever is the winner, I think each one of you will be a winner. So you should be very happy with what you have done. And my question here is that, whenever we are talking about housing problem in Hong Kong, we are either looking at the low income group or we're looking at the high income group that is buying the luxury property. but we fail to address the problem of the middle class, right? So how and when do you think that the middle class is actually going to get the benefit of their own housing in Hong Kong? So this is one. And the second one that I have is that, now with the COVID-19, you can see that a lot of people have lost their jobs. So we will be having quite a few people moving from middle class to maybe the low income group. So do you think that the problem of housing is going to become even worse? And how is the government going to handle it? So I'm going to, let all the groups answer this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. VYAS. So now we will conduct the answering session in a reverse order. So first, we'll begin with Team I.
So thank you, Professor VYAS. And regarding your first question, yes, we do think that the middle class people are always will tend to become the neglected groups in the government's housing policies. And the problem that our solutions to address that is firstly via our institutional restructure. We encourage more public engagement in the process of policy making and also execution. And that helps us. That helps us not only to focus on the public housing, which is for more lower class people, but also the enforced implementation and also the alleviation of the delay of these housing projects, and also increase the actual supply, no matter private or public housing in the markets, so that we want to control the price of these housing without directly intervening into the markets. And that increase of supply can help us to protect the rise of the middle class people. And regarding your second question, yes, we do believe that with the COVID and all the economic downturn, there may be some sufferings for the lower middle class people. And more severely, what we witness is that although the economic is facing a downturn, the housing price doesn't decrease, or it actually increases in the past maybe 12 months. So what we would suggest to the government is to really revise all the land and housing long-term strategies that I believe most of them or all of them are actually developed before the COVID crisis. So standing from now, there's really a need to develop some new more strategic land and housing policies to target the crisis and also the future economic recovery, and then to really with a more enforceable mechanism and with institutional restructure to really to enforce those projects in a timely manner.
Yes, and I would like to answer the second question. COVID-19 might be a great challenge, but we see it much as a turning point, because the problem has been long existing in Hong Kong, and we think this problem must be solved for good. If you're talking about the middle class people, one thing I think they can benefit from the long term is that maybe they can move to the new urban district, and later when the housing price there rise up decided by the market rules, they might be benefit from this.
Thank you, Team I. Now is the turn for Team C.
Yes, I would say that the middle class doesn't just suffer from the high property price, but they are quite contradicting, because on one hand, they are queuing for public housing. So they are trying to obtain government's help. But on the other hand, they are waiting for opportunities in the private market, trying to obtain a slot and then to eventually ride on the soaring property market. And I would say that meanwhile, we are trying to increase land supply and build more public housings, etc., to alleviate the problem. Government can also consider providing subsidies to them, as in another sort of expenditure relief. So say Hong Kong, we already enjoy from a relatively lower income tax, and could we be more aggressive in this? And on the other hand, how do we sponsor this sort of subsidy? Perhaps a more progressive tax system to allocate the resources from the rich to those poor, and using them to help to alleviate the problem in the short term at least.
Yes, and I have something to say. Personally, I agree that the middle class, which could not be affording like private housing are in need. But again, there are people in more need and suffering every day. So at least the housing quality of middle class is more promising than the low income class living in subdivided flats. And I think the hardcore reality is that we cannot help everyone at once. So to manifest social justice, I really think that we should focus on the most suffered. And of course, like what Bianca has said, we can of course provide some subsidy and sponsor the middle classes purchase of housing when they need it. And I think that it is also a great measure when we are focusing on what COVID is bringing to the middle class, like the economic disadvantages and also unemployment and all kinds of social problems inherited by COVID. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emcee. Now it's the turn for Team H.
Okay, so as we know that the social policies focus on conditions necessary to meet basic human needs. And for solving the problems of the whole Hong Kongers, the majority problem, which is the living conditions of low income level, should be solved first. And then the overall income could be increased. So that since the middle class, they already have the property to live. So that their problem won't be the priority. And even if the grassroots housing problem can be solved, so that it will help the society to be more stable, and so that no matter the middle class, they rent or they have the property, they still have place to live, so that it won't be the government's priority. The government should be focused on the people who need the help emergency, I think.
And under the COVID-19, I think there must be more and more people's income has decreased. But it's a relatively short-term event. The government should even more focus on the low income level for the long-term perspective. And Jack, please.
So to answer the question that the COVID will make the situation worse or not, it is quite hard to answer right now, because we need to gain more information to answer this, because many minds, and so everyone have different conditions. So for one group of middle income class, they may not have the problems because they work in the areas that not impact by COVID-19 that much, but for other group of people, they may be really in trouble. So because it's not just one family or one country's problem, but but if you want me to answer these questions in the overview, in the big pictures, I think of course if you getting worse, but it's not that worse that to change, like totally change everything, because everyone get the impact from this situations. It's not just one person, so everything will be scaled down. But I think there is still a mechanism or a dynamic that can help them to survive naturally. And after COVID gone, I think if you come back, but the condition may be changed because we have new technologies and we have adjust ourselves into this kind of situation already. But I don't think that it will really impact on the housing, land and housing issues in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Thank you, Team H. Now it's the turn for Team L.
So thank you for your question. So first of all, to address the concerns of the middle income class, I would again want to address our solution of the transferable development rights, which directly tackle this problem and their concerns. So when we say the middle income group, we are referring to a group that is both not eligible for applying for public housing and cannot afford the expensive private housing in Hong Kong right now. And the transferable development rights that we introduce to be given to all eligible citizens will include a large portion of this, will be taken up at a large portion by this middle income group. And all of them will take a stake in promoting the unlocking of more lands for more private housing supply. in specific. And so this would stabilize the price in the private property market and benefit the middle income group. And also by allowing this group to hold the TDRs for developers to purchase, they would also possess a higher bargaining power toward the land development and housing development. And this scheme would also directly present to this middle income group that their problems are being addressed and is moving toward a positive direction.
So we have the TDR serving the middle class as they are providing more private housing to the market. And we also have the PPP approach that is targeting both the lower income and middle income group as the actually opens the existing other lands for both public and private housing. Hopefully that can also follow the government plans and construct in a 73 public-private housing ratio. And we are targeting both lower and middle income groups. And we also target the lower income group by using the model housing, as we believe that it is more urgent, as we do not want to, if we do not help them, they will just suffer more from inflation and other reasons. And the low upward social mobility would just make the thing worse if we are not focusing on the lower income class as well. And if we ignore them, maybe the wealth gap will become even larger.
Yeah, just to conclude on that, just the idea of providing this, unlocking these underutilized lands, as we previously mentioned about releasing land banks as well as STT sites. We also actually see a lot of vacant school premises, for example, as well as long-term lands, including Disneyland and Kweiteng Port Terminal, in which certain land reclamation could be achieved in order to facilitate the moving of this port, for example, so that we can actually facilitate existing a closer export towards existing infrastructure and prime infrastructure. So in that case, like unlocking these sort of lands will definitely, as Dawn previously mentioned, increase the supply and ultimately stop the price from soaring too high as this is a real concern. And alternatively, as previously mentioned, of these public-private sort of partnerships. For example, there are also various other methods, for example, the idea of land readjustment, and for example, how this could actually unlock similarly 1,000 hectares of privately owned land by having private owners voluntarily distributing and giving their land to government so that they can actually eventually put public infrastructure and replot their lands back to the developers and actually bet on the fact that the property price will go up and will be a win-win situation for society, for developers and the government, because it will redistribute the gains, as well as unlocking this private land so that everyone is able to benefit from these particular adjustments. And lower price. Thank you.
Thank you, judges and teams. Now, let's give a round of applause to our judges, participating teams, and faculty for all their expertise, dedication, and hard work today as they make their way up to the front for the competition. So now the judges will engage in a 20-minute deliberation to reach a consensus over a list of winning teams. For teams, please take a 20-minute break and don't log off. You could turn off your camera and keep yourself on mute during the break. Thank you. Welcome back. I believe it could be a hard time for the judges to reach a consensus over the winning teams. They are really well-rounded and have provided much insights into the case. So now judges, will you kindly comment on the team's performances? Okay, maybe I'll say something first. First of all, I enjoy all 4 presentations. I must commend the 4 groups for doing such an excellent job within a very short period. I think 10 minutes is certainly not enough. It doesn't do enough justice to the rich content of the presentation and also the points that the 4 groups are trying to convey to the audience. And I think we all know that land and housing are very complex problems involving various issues, various interests. And it's not just a problem for Hong Kong, but if you look around us, in many other countries and societies, housing has been a very challenging social policy issue. So having said that, I think we can still find some
important features among the 4 presentations. I think for Team L, the first group, I think your main point is that the problem, the root cause of the problem is not the lack of land, but rather a lack of development. And you have outlined several experiments, in particular the TDR. And I think given what Professor Tang has said about more exciting ideas coming from younger, more creative people, and assuming you are the government, or eventually you'll be part of government, or you're part of the key stakeholders of society, I will encourage you to think further what you mean by DTR and how it could be made to work in real circumstances. Team H, I think your main focus is on consensus. And I think we all know that it's so important to push any major policy along with the aid of consensus. But the challenge that policymakers in all societies face all the time is how do you get the consensus, given that we are in a more divisive, fragmented society. And then you have different generations. You have grassroots, you have middle class, you have developers, you have owners, and landlords and tenants. So how can you get a cohesive line of thinking that everybody will subscribe to? I think that's the main challenge. And in the absence of that very broad mega consensus, is there any sort of minimal level of consensus that we can settle with that can get us forward? The third team, Team C, I think your main suggestion is that there should be policy repositioning of the government, and there should be deliberative democracy. And I think in your answers to questions, you also admit that it's not easy to have deliberative democracy, but it's something that we must try, that there should be a will on the part of government. And I respect that. And I think I appreciate your point about the importance of values, social justice. Of course, even talking about social justice, there might be different interpretations of what justice is in society. So this is something that is surely to be a challenge. The final team, Team I think I could summarize your suggestion as institutional and strategic redesign. And I think certainly improving the mechanism, the efficiency of the bureaucracy, the planning process will help. But at the end of the day, if we have tried all these tools and make these tools sharper, but we still face a shortage of land or developable land. So what would be the next steps? I think that is something worth further consideration. Overall, I think many of the points made are important, and indeed they have been mentioned in our society from time to time. But the difficulty that we face is we don't have sufficient consensus. Sometimes the will is willing, the mind is willing, but the flesh is weak. And then you have nimbism, you have short-term versus long-term interests. And also sometimes I think we need to get rid of some of the myths. For example, idle land. It's so easy to say, well, you have idle land, but how idle it is? What is the amount of land actually being idle? Is there any good reason why the land is idle? For example, if you say that developers have a lot of land, spare land. So what's the reason why they hold on the spare land and not get rid of the land and achieve the value? So there must be a reason. Maybe there's not enough incentives to encourage them to unlock the land. And it has to do with negotiation between government and the developers. But do you think the government should just get the land at any price? Would that affect public interest? So it's the kind of balancing act that we have to look into. Short-term tenancies, if I know the situation correctly, increasingly there are less STT nowadays because some of them have been rezoned for residential purpose. You mentioned also, I think one of the groups mentioned also the land for the indigenous villages. But if you look at the actual situation, the village clusters, in fact, not too much of such land could be developed in large-scale residential developments, housing developments, because of the lack of infrastructure. Sometimes, even if you're willing to invest in infrastructure physically, technically, it might not be feasible to do so. So I would encourage you, in terms of some of the reasoning, idle land or brownfield, delays, why always completion targets are always behind the schedule, look deeper into the reasons why this is the case. And maybe that will help us to unlock some of the hurdles. At least we know what are the problems, and then we focus on those problems. So I will just stop here. I think I've enjoyed the session very much, and I'm sure all the members of the four groups have invested a lot of their time, energy, their mind into the process, and that's to be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, maybe let me take the turn. Okay, so actually, so overall speaking, the presentations and also the Q&A session actually are quite enjoyable to me. But I have some observations. Okay, so one of the observations actually has been mentioned by Professor Jan before. Okay, so about the lack of insight. Okay, towards the so-called short-term or medium-term solutions. Okay, because okay, so many of the groups actually have mentioned about the long lead time for the provision of the developable land and also the housing supply. Okay, so that can be an issue. Okay, but at the same time, okay, so not many groups actually have addressed these issues, okay, adequately. Okay, in particular, okay, so they don't offer any short-term or immediate solutions, okay, that can help to ease the housing problem. Okay, at least okay in the very short run. Okay, so this is one of the issues that I want to raise. So secondly, okay, it's about the goals. So talking about the housing and land controversy in Hong Kong, actually, so we need to okay have some government policies or some strategies, okay, to ease the problem. But there are different goals. Okay, whether we want to achieve the timeliness, okay, the fairness, or just what mentioned by Professor Jan is the okay social justice. Okay, so these goals may be contradicting with each other. So we need to prioritize. Okay. I'm happy that some groups actually has given us some kind of innovative or some creative ideas. Okay, just like okay, just like group Team L. Okay, you mentioned about the TDR. Okay, actually, we also talk about TDR in some other aspect in Hong Kong, like the heritage conservation. Okay, but okay, we seldom talk about TDR in the housing development. Okay, but still, TDR has its limitation. Okay, so we have something similar in the past. Okay, that is called the letter A, letter B. Actually, it's a kind of TDR, but still, okay, that kind of tool can also address the problem of land holding. Okay, so we offer the letter A, letter B, okay, to those land holders or landowners, okay, of the farmlands, okay, in the new territories, so that the developers actually acquired all these, okay, letter A, letter B, but they just hold it, okay, hold it without, okay, using it. So that's why, okay, so approaching the handover of Hong Kong in the 90s, okay, the government actually need to do something to force or urge the developers to use it. So that's why we have the drunken old new time development, okay, so to ask the developers holding this kind of letter A, letter B, okay, to use the land development right, okay. So that can be some issues behind, okay. And also I would expect more creative or think out the box solutions. Okay, so let's say okay for group H, okay, you mentioned about the use of the land readjustment technique. Okay, so we tried that in Hong Kong actually. Okay, so there are some developers, private developers, okay, in their project, okay, they try to work with the original residents, okay, to redevelop the site. Okay, that case is very successful. Okay, but it seems that we don't have another okay successful case afterwards. Okay, so for me, actually, I am thinking about, okay, so not just relying on the private sector to do the land readjustment, because sometimes, okay, so the grassroots, okay, those people having or living in the, okay, old buildings in Hong Kong, so they have some kind of, I don't know whether it's misconception or they have mistrust in the private developers. They don't want to work with the private developers because we think that, okay, private developers, they may cheat them or they will, okay, try to lower the valuation of the properties, okay, in order to gain more profit, okay, to take advantage of those original residents. So, but how about we can ask the government, let's say the Hong Kong Housing Authority, okay, to make use of this kind of technique, okay, so to work with the, okay, the residents of the old buildings to redevelop the buildings into HOS. So HOS housing. Okay, so that may help to ease some of the problem of the mistrust. Okay, so at least, okay, so it can help to release some of the land that originally, okay, assigned for the development of HOS housing. So that kind of land can be used by the housing authority for the PRH. So to shorten the times, waiting times for the PRH applicants. Okay, so another thing that I just want you to consider, okay, not really the solution, but just kind of a consideration that, okay, you may think about. Okay, so apart from the land supply, all these kind of, okay, new housing supply, all these kind of issues or solutions, can we consider some ideas about the diversion? Okay, so talking about the demand side. Okay, so can we, let's say, okay, we have some residents, old residents living in the private rental housing in Hong Kong. Okay, so can we have them relocated to some other part? Okay, let's say in the Greater Bay Area. Okay, so of course, okay, we offer them subsidies and support, but the housing resources, okay, in the private sector can then be, okay, so released, okay, and then to be used for some other people in need. Okay, that can be a solution that you can consider. Okay.
Okay, I think all of you must be eagerly waiting for the results and you don't want to hear from us anymore. So what I would say at this moment was that each group did very, very well. And for me, each of you are a winner. So well done, everybody. And what I like the best is that even though we are conducting this online, you have coordinated with your group so beautifully and you have come up with your answers as a team rather than an individual. So well done and all the best. I think you will make very, very good future policymakers of Hong Kong.
Yeah. And I also very enjoy all of your presentation this afternoon. And I think you can do smartly, okay, to try to figure out and identify the problems of current situation about land supply as well as the housing policy problems. But of course, there are some limitations, and I think Professor Cheung as well as Simon also mentioned already. For example, like we talk about the idling lands or to release the banks, the land banks. Of course, it's very easy to talk about, but when we try to take it into practice, there's a lot of considerations. Okay, I think Professor Cheung also mentioned that already, and I think, for example, another situation like how to deal with those owners, okay, in the rural areas also and problems. So I think we can have a more in-depth thought, okay, to think about how can try to make it into practice. And second thing, I think you can also did a good job, like for the first team, I think team L, okay, I think they also did a very good job to learn from the overseas experiences. And of course, it's quite arguable whether we can build a house on the water, okay, like the Netherlands, but I think it's also very good idea. And I think you can move on, okay, to improve your overall and existing projects. So good luck to all of you here, okay?
Thank you, judges, for your dedicated comments. Now, may we invite Professor James Wong, convener from the organizing committee, to announce the winner to the case competition.
So hello teams, it's me again. So I am charged with the duty of announcing the results, and I'm very excited. I'm sure you are also very excited. And well, just let me say a few words as one of the persons, okay, one of the persons in the organizing committee. I must say you have all done very well. Okay, I echo Professor VYAS comments. You all did very well. All did a very good job. You should realize that it is never easy to have progressed, okay, to the final round. So I must say, now, even though it may sound a little bit like cliche, but I must say, regardless of the results, you should be proud of yourselves. Okay, so without further ado, okay, so I must proceed to announcing the winners. Okay, so first of all, I would like to announce the third runner-up. The third runner-up will receive 2,000 Hong Kong dollars cash prize. And the third runner-up goes to, is there some music? Okay. So it goes to team I, G4 from the Hong Kong University of Technology. Congratulations to team I. So the next one, the next prize, the second runner-up, will receive a cash prize of Hong Kong dollars, 4,000 Hong Kong dollars. So the second runner-up goes to, okay. So it goes to team H, bring Interceptors from the Education University of Hong Kong. Congratulations to team H. Well, I suppose we need some music here, really. Okay, so the remaining two teams, once I announce the first one up, you will know who the champion is. I suppose I just follow the order, okay? The first one up. So now the first one up will receive a cash prize of 6,000 Hong Kong dollars. And the first one up goes to Team L, INNOSIGHT from the Hong Kong University. Congratulations to Team L. And you know the champion. Okay, so the champion will receive a cash prize of 8,000 Hong Kong dollars. And it goes to Team C, Jarvis from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And congratulations to all teams. And may I now hand it over back to Yvonne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wong, and a huge congratulations to all teams. Now we would like to invite Professor Xin Wu, Head of the Division of Public Policy in Hong Kong in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, for a brief concluding remark.
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate all the team here, and because we are all the winner here. And I really learned a lot from your presentation, and also the question and the answer here. And Professor Tan asked the question earlier, why, or what gives you the confidence that this is a problem that bothers so many smart people, and so many smart people have worked on, and why you think that that you can come up with something really innovative here. I think that throughout the presentation, I see 3 or 4 things here and stand out. I think this is actually can be useful in terms of coming up with a new solution here. One is that most of you have adopted the so-called evidence approach, and your analysis, a lot of data are used and so forth here. So I think that is important. That's something that cannot be taken for granted here. We think that smart people make decisions and can always use data. That's not necessarily the truth here. And also in the big data era, I think that the more confident we are in using different data here, that will put us in a really a unique position to address these old problems here, right? Have bothered us for a long time. So that is something that I see across the 4 teams. You've done very well in this regard. I think the second thing quite important, which is also cannot be taken for granted, is that you've adopted the interdisciplinary approach and looking at the problem here, right? And not just a solution sounds technically right, and you look at a lot of these issues from the public management perspective, from psychology perspective, looking at engaging people and so forth here. So those are not necessarily always taken into consideration by the government agency, government official. And I think this is something, why some of the proposal new idea can make a differences is simply because they are able to adopt this interdisciplinary approach. I think that's actually quite important. The third thing I think is also quite important across the 4 teams' work is that you try to adopt a certain comprehensive approach to the issue here. And given that some of the issues, some of the solution may encounter up and downs during the implementation stage here. One of the key shortcomings by observing what happened in Hong Kong is that the government quickly went the other way when they met some resistance. And if the market actually do not turn out exactly as they predicted earlier here, right? And then they went back and forth, and that can become a significant problem here. So if you have a comprehensive plan, you can actually allow yourself to see what are the potential challenges down the road and anticipate them. So that actually can play a significant role here. So those are 3 things that I think are really all teams have done very well. And those 3 things would make our policy idea innovative, implementable, and also can get the job done at the end. So again, congratulations on all of them. And also I'd like to, again, thank Professor James Wang for leading this effort, putting it together here. Thank you very much.
Again, a final thank you for everyone for attending the session, especially judges for sparing their time and listening to our team's pitches. If you have any other questions, please contact the organizing committee through email. Now, we invite you to keep such enthusiasm and excitement on showcasing your virtual background and your warm smile so that together we can celebrate your hard work into this case competition. Ready? 3, 2, 1, cheese. Thanks all. On behalf of the organizing committee, thank you for joining us today and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.